What is going on, Badger fans? Let's talk about the running back rotation. Fickell talked about tightening it up. What does that look like? And are the Badgers good enough for Purdue to be a get-right game, or is that another one they just have to kind of grind out? Special guest coming up. We're going to talk about next. Locked On Badgers. Let's go.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, Badger fans? Welcome to Locked On Badgers, your team every single day. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Ryan Herring's Locked On Podcast Network. Today's episode brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code Locked On College for $20 off your first purchase. And coming on the show for the second time, Donnie Slusher, Badger Blitz beat writer. Welcome onto the show as always, man. I want to zoom out a little bit. Badgers are 2-2, coming off Bama, coming off USC. Fair to say it hasn't looked as clean as a lot of Badger fans and some media members want it to be. Do you think the criticism and the frustration has gone a little overboard, or has it been pretty fair?
It's mostly based on how overall I think the criticism has been fair in certain areas, but unfair in other areas. Overall, I think fans should try to be patient because it's mostly because of the way the last two losses have looked. Against Alabama, it was just a track meet. You know what I mean? They couldn't really stop them. They couldn't really slow them down in any way. But then you look at the game against Georgia, and it's like, hey, you know, not too bad, not too bad. But then the USC game, the fact that the win was in front of them, you know what I mean? But they just collapsed. I feel like if the USC game, if you flip those halves, if it starts out as an avalanche and then the second half, the Badgers play well and then they still lose by however much they lose by, but they got better as the game went on. I do feel like fans would be more positive, but there was a collapse, so it's understandable. But the way watching your team blow those two games the way that they did, it's going to warrant some anger. It's going to warrant some disappointment. But I do think that the fans could use some patience.
Yeah, two things I'll say that, and I want to ask you specifically on something. The first thing is, I think the worst spot any program can be is apathy. There was a poll, I forget who put it on Twitter the other day, but it was like, Badger fans, are you optimistic, pessimistic, or just don't care? And most people are still optimistic, and God love those people. We need those in the world, or pessimistic. Most people aren't in the I don't care category. I think that's important. People are pissed, but people are pissed because they care. You mentioned something. You said criticism fair in some spots, maybe not fair in others. I want to ask you kind of on each of those. Without putting you too much on the spot, but where do you think that criticism maybe isn't fair?
I feel like, probably talk about it more, but the thing about Longo and Locke, fans really hate both of them right now, but I feel like it doesn't really make sense to violently hate both of them because you can't hate Phil Longo, think that he's running a terrible offense, but then also get mad at Braedyn Locke for not overcoming all of that, and then being great. I think that I feel like those guys have kind of been singled out as getting the most hate, Phil Longo and Braedyn Locke. And I think that Phil Longo, he's made a lot of bad decisions, but he's not putting Braedyn Locke in a good enough position to succeed, you know? And also, but then there are also greater issues with the program in terms of talent and the way that kind of Chris left them in the last few years with recruiting that I think they're still reeling from.
I want to add on that too. I think in some circles, Longo, and listen, I didn't love the 4th and 1 call. This is just a microcosm. I don't want to focus completely on 4th and 1. I didn't love that call either, but people are correct. If Joe Brunner makes a block, maybe that play works, right? If Will Pauling catches that ball kind of down the seam before halftime, there are moments where, listen, some players just have to make plays too. And that's on both sides of the ball. You talk about people are frustrated with Jim Tressel. Well, listen, if Hunter Wohler tackles Miller Moss in the open field, maybe you hold him to a field goal there. Some players just got to make plays too. And that's not all on the coaches.
No, that is one of my biggest issues with football fans, just generally college, Badger fan, everywhere, NFL fans. I feel like there's way too much hate for coordinators and coaching. There are a lot of bad coordinators out there who make bad decisions, but also do you expect the coordinator to just go out there and make all the tackles for the players too, and make sure that they that the balls don't go through their hands? I understand that a lot of tackling and stuff you can pinpoint that to coaching, but it's not the players have to make plays, like you said. You know what I mean? And So, yeah, like, there are a lot of issues, but I do feel like once the talent improves, once Fickell's, like, recruiting classes kinda get in and get going, I do think that things will improve.
Let me ask you then flip it. You said some spots where criticism is maybe fair as well. What are some spots where you're like, yeah, that has felt a little off? I'm not fully sure why even, but where has it been warranted a little bit?
We'll keep talking about him. We'll talk about something else soon, but, I mean, Phil Long, it was just a bad hire. I feel like, it just doesn't seem, I mean, I was kinda going deeper on Phil Longo, like, you know, for an article I'm writing, and he hasn't been the dominant offensive mind since, like, 2016 when he was a coach at Sam Houston State, I believe. He went to Ole Miss, offensive head coach. He went to North Carolina, Mac Brown, very good offensive coach. He hasn't had to lead an offense in 8 years, and that was at Sam Houston State. So I feel like there were some red flags there, and also, when you look at North Carolina, their best offenses and their best years were when they had clear NFL guys on their roster, so, like, back, like, that year, I think it was 2020, 2021, when he had Michael Carter and Javonte Williams both rush for over 1,000 yards. Those guys were, like, a 2nd and a 4th rounder, I think, and then Drake May and Josh Downs, that struggled for a little bit, then Drake May and Josh Downs, Drake May, what, 4th overall pick, and then Josh Downs, like, a 2nd rounder, and then they struggle after that, you know what I mean? So, Longo, his mindset is a little bit of, let the guys go out there and win, and the guys don't seem good enough to go out there and win. And I mean, and that thing about the 4th and 1 call, like you talk about like too much criticism. I feel like there's for that being one play and then Alabama just one play, I do think that there's a little bit too much criticism when it comes to the blocking. But yeah, like that play is very indicative of Longo just saying like, "Oh, I don't need to do anything anything creative, no motion, no nothing. Just let the guys go and line up and try to win." And then your margin for error really shrinks. And so when Joe Brunner misses a block, or when Riley Nowakowski chooses to double team a guy with Jack Nelson and leave an edge rusher to just go and blow Tawi up, you don't get the play.
Well, and here's what I'd say too on that, because again, I didn't love the play. I think you can find a middle ground where you don't really love what you're seeing, but it's also not all on the coach. But when players are double teaming at the wrong point of attack, some of that is on coaching now. Like some of that is on you're not executing the scheme we want you to do. And then
Right.
the other thing I'd say is if you have a pattern of like, hey, this isn't working. Maybe it didn't work against Bama. Again, Bama's really good. It didn't work against USC. Maybe you need to simplify it a little bit. Like get downhill a little bit more. Let's stop pulling the two backside guys. I don't know. I feel like there's moments where there's a bit of stubbornness, and that's not just Longo. I think all coaches have a little bit of stubbornness in them, but you got to probably be a little more moldable. Um, I want to talk about running backs too. Like Luke Fickell, this has been a long term thing all year, right? We have a lot of running backs. You're trying to use them all. Luke Fickell has talked about maybe shortening that rotation. A, do you think that's going to happen? And then B, what do you think that looks like if it does?
I think it kind of has to happen, because they're a team that says after the Alabama game, like they got a lot of questions. Does this team have an offensive identity? And Fickle and pretty much every player said, yeah, we're a running team. We lean on the offensive line. And you can't be a rushing team with the way that the, the production as at least look. It doesn't even really feel right. You know what I mean? And this is the first year, and I don't know how long the Badgers haven't had like that clear number one, powerhouse running back, and they seem kind of lost. You know what I mean? And so like they kind of have to. And what Fickle said was right. It was one of the more honest things that he said. He just says like guys can't get in rhythm. Like, guys can't get hot if they're getting like 3 rushes but then disappearing for a
Mhm.
quarter. You know what I mean? And for how that looks, I think based on what we saw in training camp, Tawi got the most run in training camp. And maybe they were just trying to preserve Chez because he's injury prone, but Tawi got the most run and he looked the best in training camp. I think that if especially against Purdue with kind of a weaker rushing defense, I think that they're going to try to get Tawi going early. I think that they want him to be the number one back, but he hasn't looked quite that good yet. And then I'd say they probably want Chez to be number two. He's not as good as he used to be based on injuries, but he's still very athletic. I mean, he's also a leader. Like that's another thing that fans don't really understand about, like players, they want the leaders to play. Like Jake Chaney, like people are always saying like I've seen people on Twitter say that like that they should bench him in favor of Tack Curtis, and it's like a fair point. But Jake Chaney, like he's also like the quarterback of the defense, as other guys have said, you know. And but back to the running backs, Fickell said that he wants like a lead back, kind of like an
Mhm.
offhand, and then like a spare. So I think if I was to predict, I would say Tawi lead hand, Ches Malusi less than that, and then Cade kind of coming in for because it seems like Cade, you could just give him the ball at any point and he can just bust off a 10 or 15-yard run. And fans may be a little bit upset to not hear Darion Dupree mentioned in there, but I feel like since him and Dylan Jones are kind of I feel like they're gonna have the keys to the offense next year. Like they're gonna be like the heart and soul of the running back game. I don't think the coaches are like anxious to get them on the field. I mean, maybe I feel like it'll mostly be in sort of a if the top three guys aren't performing, then we'll bring in Darion.
Yeah, and to me, it's not even a Darian thing, who I'm very high on. I like him and Jones. It's to me, the weird one is Yak because however you want to slice it, he's averaging 7.29 yards per carry on an offense that's struggling to move the ball. Like, is it sometimes this is again where I go back to, and I'm a fan. Like, I'm not a coach, I'm not writing it up on the whiteboard, but sometimes isn't it as simple as give him the ball until he's not averaging 7.2 yards per carry? Like, isn't there just an element of you said it. You said it without saying it. It feels like you could give him the ball at any point and he can rip off 10 yards. It doesn't feel like that with Ches. And I'm not yelling at you, by the way. I'm just that's the one
No, no.
that I don't fully get. Like, give him the ball more, at least until he's not that productive.
That's like that's like one of the simple things with like Phil Longo that's like you just don't understand. It's like even like Tretch, like he's had a couple drops, but when he gets the ball, he looks good. But no, it's who cares? But Kate, yeah, he's one of those guys where it's like a weird thing where I feel like coaches are equally as surprised as like players developing as like the fans or like analysts are. You know what I mean? So like in their minds, they're like, all right, we got Tall, like we're bringing in Tall. He'll pair nicely with Ches. Then we got kind of the young guys. Let's get them primed, and then like out of nowhere, Cade Giacomelli puts on. He just gets shredded, and then looks so like a way better running back than last year. Then they don't really know what to do. But I mean, it's not like I don't know why he's not getting more run because it's not like there's like some dominant running back ahead of him, who's looked way better. I mean, it's still like a thing of them. I feel like they're trying to like establish the hierarchy more with like getting Ches and Tawi more involved, but man, they need offense. They need some dynamic players, and Cade has been dynamic. They could give him the ball or not, but it doesn't really make sense to not.
That's kind of where I'm at. It reminds me of Isaac Garendo, who was also pretty explosive and on an offense that wasn't very good. And it was like they just couldn't find a way to use this guy who just kept producing when he got carries. And Yak's not perfect. Yak had a fumble. Yak sometimes just runs into people, but he also hits the hole really decisively. He's pretty big, strong, physical. I don't know. That one frustrates me more than Dupree, to be honest. I know people want to see the young cats. I just kind of want to see what does Yak look like if you give him 12 carries and 3 catches in a game.
Yeah,
I don't know. But we've seen it with the other guys so far, and it hasn't looked that great. So that's where I'll go with that one. We got to take one quick break. I want to come back. We're going to talk about the Purdue game in particular. Is that a get-right game for the Badgers, or are the Badgers not quite good enough for a get-right game? We're going to talk about that next with Donnie on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick break for our friends of the show over at Game Time. Game Time remains the number one source for all your sports betting needs. If you are all your ticketing needs, I apologize, our sports betting sponsors coming up. If you need to get tickets to any event, any game, basketball's coming up, obviously baseball playoffs, NFL's going on, a lot of stuff out there. Game Time is your way to get more entertainment, more experiences in your life. It's fast, it's easy, it's simple, and you have a great it removes all the logistics from buying tickets. You don't have to plan months in advance. They have flash sales at the end, so you get cheaper prices the closer the thing gets. And I've done it from the taxi, from the Uber, on my phone on the way to a stadium, and got tickets emailed to me before we got there. Braves, Phillies. Like, it is the best place to get tickets. Download Game Time app today. Remove the stress. Snag the tickets without that stress with Game Time. Download the app. Use code LOCKEDON for $20 off. All right, let's get back into this conversation with Donnie. Donnie, as always, man, where can people find everything you're doing, all the work you got going on?
BadgerBlitz.com. It's where all my stuff is published. But Twitter's the best way. Twitter's what I'm most active on. Pretty much the only social media I'm really active on. At Donnie Slusher _ you see it up there. It's where I'm most active. It's where I'd recommend people go to follow me.
Let me ask you this, because I made a point. The Badgers are at maybe a potential runway here. You're out of that first chunk of games. You've got Purdue, you've got Rutgers, you've got Northwestern. Is this kind of the start of a get right period for the Badgers? Is Purdue a get right game, or are we just not in that era of Badgers football anymore?
I think it kind of has to be. I do still feel confident that this Badgers team can be good, and especially because again, I mean, against Purdue, I referenced earlier, they have easily the worst run defense in the Big Ten. I think they're giving up 240 rushing yards per game, which is obscene, and also like 70 yards higher than
Mhm.
the next highest team. So I feel like that'll make things easier for them. Like that, like it feels pretty like their game plan feels pretty simple. It almost feels written for them, especially with what Fickell said, like about establishing like the hierarchy. So I feel like if that looks good, if we can tell that they're trying to establish the run and they're successful at it, then I feel like because the team needs an identity, the team needs something to hang their hat on. They need something to do when nothing's working, and I feel like this will at least build confidence. Like after a game like Alabama, I understand like confidence kind of gets hurt, and especially against like also against like USC, like they're a really great team. Against Purdue, these guys are human. Shouldn't be as hard of a game. I think they'll build confidence going into Rutgers, which is apparently going to be harder than I thought. Before the season when looking at the schedule. But yeah, these next three games, if they can establish a run game and also like get better at run defense because Purdue has Devin Mockabee, who's no slouch. I feel like they just have to get back to basics coming
Yeah,
up.
and Purdue, I think to your point is averaging. I think you're giving up 5.2 yards per carry. It's something like that. I mean, they are and they just fired their offensive coordinator, so they're going to be coming into this game. New offensive coordinator, porous rush defense. They do have Hudson Card, who's been okay this year, completing about 65% of his passes. But yeah, this has got to be a game where Wisconsin looks good. And quite frankly, if they don't, I don't know where you look on the schedule to feel optimistic, right? If this is a struggle, they have to look better. What do the Badgers need to do in this 3-game stretch? Do they need to go 3-0 is tough considering what we've seen from this Badgers team in terms of consistency. I think they have to go 2-1 at least, right?
If they don't, I mean, we'll know because really, like, I feel like what we're kind of gearing up towards is the November stretch, starting with the end of October. Who is it? Penn State, Iowa, Oregon, Nebraska, leading into Minnesota. I feel like the Badgers fans will know by that time whether or not the season's over. You know what I mean? Like whether or not they have like a chance to stay like at least somewhat competitive. Because if they don't, like you said, if they don't go 2-1, then it's gonna look pretty rough. You know what I mean? And not just 2-1, but they have to look like a team with some sort of identity, even if they're not using every single offensive weapon that they should. Even if they're not like absolutely blowing teams out, they have to act like a team that knows who they are and knows who their players are. And it's been kind of a struggle the past few games. So I mean, like I said, run game, they have to show that they're not soft either. But also, I mean, they have to it can't just be like purely run game old Wisconsin. Like they have to let Braedyn Locke develop some confidence. You know what I mean? Because he's going to be playing the like Penn State, Iowa, Oregon, Nebraska. They have some pretty great defenses. And if he doesn't feel at least if he doesn't feel confident going into that stretch, the Badgers will be way too easy to defend, and they probably won't have much of a chance in those games anyways.
Where is your confidence in him? Like you mentioned, he needs to feel confident going into it based on what you saw from USC, obviously what we saw last year, what you saw in practice. You were there in practice as well. Are you confident in Braedyn Locke? Again, not putting you on the spot here, but it felt okay-ish against USC.
Honestly, with the way the reaction has been against Braden Lock, I almost feel like I almost feel like the human urge to be more positive about him just because of like all the comments I've seen. But like I said earlier, he's not good enough to like put the offense on his back and carry them through like against tough teams. But I do have faith in him because of what I saw in practice. That like the early spring camp session, he looked like a different quarterback. Honestly, like he was taking chances, he was accurate, he was doing things that like we saw last year. I feel like we just kind of saw him like he had that great game against Illinois, like when he was throwing deep and he kind of came out of his shell. Then I feel like as the next games progressed, he was kind of slowly went back into his shell.
Mhm.
And he's a guy like that needs confidence and he needs to be able to trust his playmakers. And they haven't really given him early on. It was working against USC. There was obviously that Vinny catch, which was the best Badgers play in years, maybe. Um, and then he had a few, like I liked how he played in the first half, and then the second half, I thought there were some good plays, but, there was receiver drops, and I feel like the second half, it was kind of like the entire offense just kinda shut off, and he wasn't good enough to, like, turn them back on again, which is a shame, and it's what you want out of a quarterback with, like, especially with a team that, their roster isn't as developed as fans once thought. You want a guy who's gonna be able to lead you out of that, but I just don't think Braedyn Locke is that guy, and Tanner Mordecai wasn't even that guy last year. Tyler Van Dyke, he had a good start to the season, but I feel like this offense might be a little bit too problematic for Braedyn Locke to have, like, a great season. You know what I mean? I think that he can improve, especially if they kinda simplify things with the playmakers, like but it's not gonna like, the offense will have to improve with him. He's not gonna drag the offense out of the gutter.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The offense has to grow with him. He's not the guy who's going to take that offense with him. I think when you watch his game, there's moments where it feels kind of like if you've played video games in football, where as a quarterback, you just kind of keep going back and back into the pocket. You're not decisive. It feels like he's not very decisive and he gets kind of happy feet. He keeps moving backwards in the pocket. Now, he doesn't have a ton of live reps, really. So theoretically, he should get better as he gets more and more reps. And quite frankly, he should get better as he doesn't play Ohio State, Iowa, USC, and Bama. Like he's played a loaded schedule, but I'm kind of there with you. I'm kind of in the same boat. All right, we're gonna take one more break. I want to come back and talk to Donnie about the offseason. Should we have expected more from some of these pieces? Good question. Plus, any storylines that he thinks need to be talked about a little bit more. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick break for our friends of the show over at FanDuel. FanDuel remains the number one source for all your sports betting needs, whatever you need over at FanDuel. And it's a great time to do it. I always say, please do it responsibly, but head over to FanDuel.com. $5 gets you a $200 bonus bet guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And like I said, baseball playoffs are starting today. It's going on right now. Basketball's coming up, college basketball, NBA, NFL, college football. It's a great time to head over to FanDuel. Spice up your sports weekend over at FanDuel.com. $5 bet gets you $200. Your first $5 bet gets you $200 in guaranteed bonus bets. It's over at FanDuel.com, the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, let's get back to Donnie. I want to lead off here. Storyline or item that you don't think is being talked about enough?
I mean, based on the biggest befuddlement with me is like the team I feel like I saw in offseason camp. It just looks completely different from the one that we see now. It just feels like a total like lack of aggression. It feels like Fickell like let his coordinators kind of like cut it loose, like during camp, and it was like, all right, like how much can we do? And then now the season starts. It's like, all right, it's like how like what can we do to like just win? And then it just feels a little bit scared, based on, like compared to what we saw in offseason. And obviously pre like offseason, there's less days where you can tackle, so there's gonna be less run game. There's gonna be a lot more passing plays, and I feel like when we saw in practice, when they were more aggressive and the receivers and quarterbacks were able to get into a rhythm, this offense can like they can throw it deep, they can be explosive, but it's just really hard when you do like three straight runs and then one play where you try to do a long pass on third and down, on third and long, and then it doesn't work. So I just feel like that they should be more aggressive, and I know that, like, fans can't that hasn't been talked about because like, this is all that the fans know of the team, but I saw a really aggressive defense too, like and we'll get to that with some of the transfers, but, I mean, I feel like I just saw them blitz all day in camp, and the quarterbacks couldn't really deal with it, you know what I mean? And it seems like their strategy is based on the players that they brought in, that they wanna be more aggressive, they wanna send more pressure and kinda rely on the cornerbacks, but they've just been looking kinda conservative, and that's the biggest thing. It's just more befuddlement with me than anything.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because I was there for some of the Platteville stuff too, and the defensive looks did feel more aggressive. It felt like there was more people line of scrimmage. It felt like there was more chaos they were trying to bring. I wonder because here's what I usually say about coaches: coaches aren't always right, but they're usually not dumb at this level, right? So why is it like why do you think Tressel is choosing? We'll focus on defense to maybe play a little more. I don't think passive is the right word, but maybe a little more conservatively. Because he's not doing it randomly. My theory is some of the he's sent blitzes and some of the guys aren't winning their one-on-ones. So you're sending blitzes, but you're not really getting home, and then you're leaving your secondary kind of out to dry. And I think he's kind of pulled back a little bit because of that. But I don't know. What's
Mhm.
your take on that?
I think again, it feels like more conservatism. It feels like they're kind of like they know that they can blitz, but it might happen. And okay, so like the first 2 games, those were very conservative offenses, and want to make those games harder than they had to be. So they were playing more conservative on defense. They were saying like they didn't want to make it a track meet. They didn't want to like blitz a ton of guys and then leave a receiver open, and then suddenly it's a completely different game. I understand that. And then against Alabama, they couldn't really rush the passer or defend, in the back end. So
That's a
they
tough
were like,
combo.
so I feel so I feel like Tressel was like, well, I mean, we're not stopping them the back. Like, we're not gonna like. I don't want to continue to give up, 60-yard bombs to Ryan Williams. And then against USC, it felt like there was more pressure. It felt like there was a lot more pressure. But like you said, they weren't winning one-on-ones, and USC's offense has playmakers, and they were making plays. And so I feel like the Badgers should just like commit. You know what I mean? Like if you're gonna be aggressive, be aggressive.
I think with the USC thing too, and I agree with you. I actually thought the pressure wasn't the problem against USC. I think they hit them quite a bit. They got a couple of nice looks. They forced a fumble. And honestly, both their turnovers were off pressure. One was off Hills and one was off Austin Brown. But with USC, when you blitzed them, they just threw slot fades or go routes to their 6'3" receivers, right? Like, and then
Mhm.
when you played zone, you didn't get to him, and he just picked you apart. It felt a little no win against USC, but I agree with your overall point. Let me ask you this as we wrap up the show. Off season, do you think they did enough? Like it felt like we thought they quote unquote won the off season, at least defensively. They rebuilt the linebacker group. We liked what they did. Was it a successful off season?
Well, I mean, it really relates to the last question because it seems like they brought in guys with the mindset of wanting to play aggressive and really turn the heat up, but it just hasn't worked out early. Like for example, like the outside linebackers, like John Pius and Leon Lowry, like those are both like they looked really good in the offseason. Like they were really hyped additions. They haven't looked that great against like they just haven't produced early on, like objectively. And I think a lot of that. I mean, and also you think like Tackett Curtis and Jaheim Thomas, like those are 2 guys who are just like athletic freaks, and like most of the plays are like they were often rushing the passer in the off like in off-season camps. But I think I saw Jaheim, he has 1 pressure on the year, and he's not that
Mm.
great in coverage either. So it seems like they brought in a bunch of players and have just not used them properly, or have just decided to kind of play in a different way than they originally planned. And I think that's on coaching most of all. But at the same time, these guys have to win their one-on-ones. And like us as outsiders will never know like where the line between like how much of it is the outside linebackers just not playing well enough and how much of it is their coaching not being well enough.
Right.
We'll never know. It's hard like it's hard to really predict. But Fickle, like they had good players at Cincinnati. They had some really good defenders at Cincinnati. Like I mean, I think it's another thing that, and also they arguably didn't bring in enough guys because if you look at the roster last season, they really had like barely enough guys to like start. You know what I mean? Like competent starters. Like the outside linebacker group, they was running on like 3 guys. Cornerback room was really thin. I mean, even inside linebackers, and I feel like it's one of those things. Like I compared it to like a coat of paint. You know what I mean? Like after the first off season they're here, it's like the first coat, and it's like, oh, it doesn't look that good. Still a bunch of holes. Second one, all right, looks a lot better, but there's still some holes. I mean, there's still some flaws, and maybe it'll take another off season, or maybe it's going to take some coaching changes. Who knows?
I like that analogy. And if it's me painting, it's going to take several years to fix this thing. It's going to take several coats. I'm going to get you out of here on this one because I know you need to get going at here pretty soon. But give me one player, and I didn't prep you on this, but give me one player that hasn't played a ton this year that you think is going to have a bigger role going forward. And a couple guys because I've been thinking of, so I'll let you think about it for a second. I think a guy like Sebastian Cheeks, who was starting to get reps in the USC game, if the outside linebackers continue to maybe not be that disruptive that we hoped, maybe that's a guy who plays an outsized role. Maybe it's a Vinny Anthony who starts to get more and more of those boundary reps. Is there a guy that you're looking at? You're like, I think he might be a bigger role going forward.
It feels. I mean, it almost feels too easy to say Tretch, just because he was the guy that was so hyped in the offseason. Every reporter. I mean, and also I was thinking you watch in practice, you watch like the individual reps, and if you watch 10 guys run a route, run the same exact route, like the athleticism reveals itself. You know what I mean? The
Mhm.
athleticism flows to the top. And every day watching Tretch, every time he went out and ran a route, I thought that guy's different. That guy moves differently. Guys like that don't just walk through Wisconsin. And he's a guy that obviously got a lot of attention before the season from me a lot of time. Every person who would walk up to me in real life and ask how the Badgers were, I'd bring up Tretch, or how the Badgers are going to be. I'd always bring up Tretch, and he's the guy I've seen like people talk about on social media like the past week or so, being like why isn't this guy more involved? And he's one of those guys. I mean, if he stays on the roster for next year, because I could honestly, if I was him, I'd be pretty pissed off, you know. But if he does stay on the roster and there's no sea change, I feel like it's going to be like finding an $100 bill in your closet. You know what I mean? It's like oh my god, like how did the last guys not know about that? You know what I mean? And I feel like that's an easy answer. But also you think about like some of the freshmen. I know it's tough playing freshmen. You can't always expect them, but like Kyan Barry Johnson, he's another slot receiver who I thought looked great. Like you said, Vinny Anthony, Quincy Burrows too. There are a
Mhm.
lot of guys, like it's like a lot of weapons. I feel like that are being underutilized, which is one of the big issues with Longo. I feel like.
Yeah, those are some good ones. Burrows and KBG. Maybe Heiberger as well. He gets healthy, starts to work himself into some type of role somewhere with his athleticism. That's
Yeah.
that's a guy they like. He is Donnie Slusher. Go check him out over at Badger Blitz Rivals. Importantly, at Donnie Slusher _. Donnie, man, as always, really do appreciate the time, man. And I hope to see you down at some basketball stuff coming up pretty soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, Ryan. Appreciate it.
And of course, for everyone listening on Wisconsin, and we will talk tomorrow.